Colleagues, as you will know, Bill C-41 creates an authorization regime to facilitate the delivery of international assistance in geographic areas controlled by a terrorist group as defined in the Criminal Code.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. I think it's important to underline where the debate on this bill is in this Parliament. Nobody in any of the opposition parties, I think, disputes the urgency of the humanitarian crisis or the need for legislative action. In fact, the issue has been the significant delays from the government side moving this forward, and concerns about whether the regime will work effectively for those organizations who need to use it. At the time Kabul was falling, your government, instead of attending to the situation, was calling an election. We had an Afghanistan committee that called for these changes a year ago. We haven't seen anything on it until now. We had a motion at the Foreign Affairs Committee that I moved in the fall, a second motion at the Foreign Affairs Committee earlier in the spring. So you're going to have strong agreement that action is required, and I think in principle with the legislation moving forward. We wish the government, I wish the government had acted earlier, and I remain concerned about just the effectiveness and the efficiency of the regime helping organizations get the aid to where it needs to go. I want to ask specifically, how long do you expect it to take to approve these kinds of applications? Can we expect that all of the enabling regulations and processes will be in place to allow humanitarian organizations to rapidly deliver the aid that's needed once this legislation passes? In particular, that we don't come near another winter in Afghanistan without the legislation not only being passed, but exceptions granted so that it can be used.
Well, first, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Ginnis, I share the concern and the sense of urgency in aiding the people of Afghanistan who, as I pointed out in my introductory remarks, have been subject to human rights violations, oppression, torture, killings, and disproportionately towards women and girls and religious minorities. And that is precisely why, as part of the bill, we contemplate having a streamlined process, one that will efficiently work with organizations that have put themselves forward as candidates for authorizations to deliver this aid, but with the requisite security checks that are required both to protect the integrity of the program as well as to guard against any potential risks that may flow from the funds to, or where, I beg your pardon, a de facto a regime like the Taliban Authority, who is listed under the Criminal Code as a terrorist entity, may inadvertently benefit. We need to strike that balance and do it in a way that promotes transparency, accountability, but with the sense of urgency that I think all parliamentarians are united behind in getting that aid to Afghanistan.
Thank you, Minister. I won't repeat the question around what you expect to be the specific timeline. I'm quite tight for my own timeline for questions. But if you can follow up in writing, or your officials can follow up with an estimate of the turnaround time that organizations could expect in terms of applications. I know we need to strike a balance, but we would like you to try to quantify what exactly that balance would be. Another specific question: would this legislation only apply in the case of areas controlled by listed terrorist organizations? What I'm hearing from some of the stakeholders is that it doesn't appear to only apply to territory controlled by listed terrorist organizations.
Well, certainly that is our top priority. And those organizations which have been listed as terrorist entities under the Criminal Code meet that definition and, by extension, pose a risk and a threat to Canadian interests both here and abroad, as well as to the people where they may be operating, and certainly within the geographic areas where we are trying to get aid to. I would submit, Mr. Ginnis, that through that lens, that it is important that as we receive applications and as we screen both the principal sponsors of those applications as well as the activities that will be authorized under the regime, that we look at all of the circumstances. Okay, but can I just zero in on the specific question, which is the intention of this legislation to only deal with situations where territory is controlled by a listed terrorist organization, or is it intended to apply to cases of organizations that are concerning from a certain perspective for whatever reason, but are not listed as terrorist organizations? As I was saying towards the end of my answer, the primary focus is to make the assessment.
But not who the primary focus is. Is the intention of the legislation to only apply to listed organizations or to apply to organizations that are not listed?
Mr. Jennis, if you'll allow me to finish my answer, I think it will be responsive to the point that you're making.
Okay, quickly, please. I want to get one more in before.
We are making this assessment through primarily the listing of terrorist organizations as defined under the code, but the security review will look at all of the factors on the ground and assess and be sure that we are able to mitigate against those risks. So I think you will agree that yes, while, for example, in Afghanistan, we will be making these assessments on the basis of the reality that the Taliban are the controlling authority in that region.
Sorry, I want to get one more question. Respectfully, I don't think that's a very clear answer, but I would welcome a follow-up in subsequent rounds or in writing. I wanted to ask, this bill contemplates other organizations being listed and the implications there. Could you give us an update on the government's considerations around listing the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization?
Well, first, I would say we're vigilant about making sure that we list entities that do meet the definition, and we rely on our nonpartisan professional public servants to provide us with the best possible advice on that exercise, and where appropriate, we move expeditiously to ensure that we are listing those organizations so that Canada is not a safe haven either for the flow of terrorist funds or is a safe haven for any terrorist activity.
I do want to press you on this issue of what constitutes a terrorist organization for the purpose of this legislation, because I think this is really important. The Criminal Code defines a terrorist group as either a listed entity or an entity that has as one of its purposes or activities facilitating or carrying out any terrorist activity. So a terrorist group doesn't necessarily mean a listed terrorist group. There could be terrorist groups that are not listed according to the Criminal Code. Now, the definition of terrorist activity is long and detailed.
I'm somewhat familiar with it.
But it could, from my reading, include not just non-state actors, but also state actors that engage in violations of international law. There's no clear exclusion that other states, in certain cases which Canada recognized, couldn't necessarily be considered terrorist organizations. The legislation puts the onus on humanitarian organizations to determine whether or not they need to apply for this exemption. So in a case with a listed terrorist organization controlling territory like Afghanistan, it's relatively clear-cut that an exemption would be required. There may be cases where it's not clear whether or not an organization is engaging in terrorist activity according to the Criminal Code or not, and therefore whether an exemption is required. And this legislation could actually create additional problems for organizations wondering, do I need to apply for an exemption or not, operating in this particular area where an organization controls territory that may not be listed. So to me, that's a clear problem, and it speaks to the need for clarity around whether we're just talking about listed organizations or whether we're talking about any organization that's defined as terrorist. So what is your response to that, and would you be supportive of providing that clarity in this legislation going forward?
The short answer is yes. I realize we're tight on time, but I think you raise a valid point. I'd say two things in response very quickly. One, I actually think the flexibility of the terrorist definition is a positive thing in a case where we're trying to get aid to an area where the de facto authority may not be a terrorist entity, but there may be terrorist activity. But secondly, I would just add to that what you may have characterized as a problem, I see as an opportunity to work with those stakeholders in this space to make sure that we can help them navigate that process.
Minister, that answer concerns me more because the organizations don't benefit from this flexibility. They're left holding the bag, not knowing whether or not they're going to be prosecuted if they proceed in a particular case. They need clarity in law.
Time is up.
We'll provide them that.
I'm going to...